So guess what this weekend is? Julian Castro is this weekend, International Speaker Series, right here. If you bought tickets, you probably got, I don't know, a fairly annoying series of emails from us, but it tells you really useful things like, what you need to know before you go, where you park, where you can eat, all those things. Ooh, now I can do my radio voice. We're really, really excited. This is the first in 4 events in our International Speakers Series. This is our 19th year. I think it's really prescient that we are focusing on youth and youth empowerment and the changing face of activism in the world. So I hope we see all of you at the Newmark Theater. Reminder, it's not at the Schnitz. If you go there, I think you're going to end up, it's a children's concert, I believe. I'm sure it'll be just as entertaining and educational. So this is this weekend. If you haven't bought your tickets, you could be one of the 130 people lucky enough to still get in, because that's about how many tickets we have left, and single tickets are available for both Castro and the entire series. So if you're going to be picky and you only want to see 1 or 2, you can buy single tickets now. We, of course, would love if you just bought the series, because sometimes you get surprised by things that you aren't prepared for, or a speaker that you've never heard of. So that's always my favorite, is to have a ringer that no one expected. And everyone comes back and go, I never heard of them, but God, they were great. Anyway, if you came in earlier, you probably saw that I had up on the screen Ambassador Joseph Yun, who has been in Hanoi for an event that turned out to be a non-event. But he is going to join us March 21st, 7 p.m. in our offices to look at what just happened between the U.S. and North Korea. For those of you who don't know Joseph, he has spoken for us in the past. He was the former special envoy on North Korea. He was ambassador to Malaysia. He's extremely knowledgeable. He's probably one of the most knowledgeable folks you can find who can really talk about North Korean policy and the U.S. He's now currently with the United States Institute of Peace, and it's great when he gets to come back to Oregon, where he's from, and share his knowledge with us. And thank you, Melanie, for helping poke him and get him to do it. It's kind of a month of ambassadors. 4 days after that, we have Gordon Sondland, who is the EU ambassador, who is going to be talking about transatlantic ties and our relationship with the EU. So if it's not enough that we're looking at the Asian pivot, we're looking at who we're making mad on the other side of the pond, and it should be a great month for that. I think, as I've mentioned, books, the Great Decisions books, as we're nearing the end of the series, are now $22, down from $32. So if you don't have one, and you want a collector's item for your vast library of international affairs, I would recommend getting them before they all go away. And then next week is our final Great Decisions event of the year. We will have Maureen Hickey, who will talk us through issues on refugees and global migration. So I hope you can all join us for that. Again, as always, we are streaming live. Be on your best behavior. This is not a mosh pit. We don't like 4-letter words. And if you have a question, it better be in a mic that I hand to you so we can hear that and the people at home can hear it. If you miss a live stream, you can also get it off of our YouTube channel. So last week's is not up yet, should be probably this afternoon. And today I'm very excited. Actually, exactly a year ago, Alex Montgomery, who is at Reed College, spoke for us on nukes and networks. And so if you missed that, I'm assuming that there's plenty to fill in since then. The nuke issue is not going away. It's just, I guess it's rearing its ugly head, and we're going to learn a bit more about that. Alexander Montgomery is at Reed College. He has published articles on theorizing and dismantling proliferation networks, the perils of predicting proliferation. Such a hard word to say. Intelligence and the future of security studies. He has been a resident fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and he was a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow in Nuclear Security with a placement in the U.S. Office of the Secretary of Defense. So he's knowing a thing or two about a thing or two. Let's give a big hand to Alex Montgomery.
Thank you, Tim. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm glad to see that, unlike my students, there are a few people who are willing to sit in the front row, so I appreciate that. So today, talking about proliferation, past, present, and future. I don't know how many of you have done the reading. This is also a problem with my students. Yes, many? Some hands up? Oh, terrific. Okay, that's probably better than my students. The article was pretty comprehensive, and I wanted to hit a few specific things, and although I'm happy to take questions and about sort of anything related to nuclear proliferation. But what I wanted to focus on today, sort of the past, go through a series of questions, and this is drawing on the wider academic literature, which is some of the same stuff which the article which you read drew upon. I wanted to sort of pose it as a series of questions on nuclear weapons. So why proliferate? You know, why try to? What are the incentives for countries to try to arm themselves with any kind of weapons? Why nuclear weapons in particular? Why is there this incentive for it? Who has tried? There's many more states than you might have expected, which is actually good news. I'll tell you why it's good news when I get there. Talk about why so long and so few, which is to say, why is it that it takes states so long? When I say states, I mean countries, by the way. Hopefully that was apparent. Why have so few of them succeeded, and why does it take so long? And this goes back to the beginning. The Manhattan Project took 3 years, and everyone else has taken a longer time since then, so it's kind of puzzling. Who has helped? So there's been a lot made of proliferation networks, which is my specialty in the field of nuclear proliferation, and sort of tracing exactly who's helped whom, either intentionally or unintentionally, as sort of a key question about trying to predict exactly who's going to get nuclear weapons and why exactly countries help each other in trying to get nuclear weapons. And then I'll talk about my own work a little bit, which is why hasn't help worked better? This is based on a piece that I published called Stop Helping Me, which went through various different cases of nuclear proliferation, which it seems that this foreign assistance, which you would think would, for the most part, speed up nuclear programs, in some case has slowed them down. I then want to move on. I was sort of debating what I should talk about for the present, but North Korea has solved that problem for me, so I'll be talking about North Korea. I'm happy to talk about other states, the India-Pakistan dispute that's going on right now, if you're interested in that. Talk about Iran, and how Saudi Arabia seems determined to sort of show up on the list of the usual suspects. But I want to focus on the DPRK because, of course, it's sort of preeminent in everyone's minds. Talk about, well, how did they succeed when other countries which were richer or had more help from other countries? How did the DPRK manage to succeed? That's the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. How powerful are their weapons? How big is it? This is an important question, as I'll get to. Can they deliver them? So there's been some doubts placed in by some certain administration officials and others saying that, oh no, well, we're going to stop them before they get certain capabilities. I'll give you a spoiler: they already have them, and I'll explain, how we know that and why. What have we done about it? What has the U.S. done about it? So I have a little sort of back and forth, which I like to call "Who Threatened Better?" Series of tweets and responses between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, and you can decide for yourselves who threatened better. I'll then talk about the most recent nuclear posture review. So this is the review which was conducted and released last year, which sort of lays out exactly what the U.S. thinks it's doing about nuclear weapons, what it intends to do with them, what it intends to do for the future, and also addresses a number of sort of important threats. And then I'll sort of end with a really brief bit about the future. Well, now what? What should the U.S. be doing right now with respect to proliferation? So let me just start with why proliferate. And hopefully, so if this isn't visible from the back, I'm going to try to talk through certain parts of it. I apologize for the wordiness of some of the slides and the tables. I am an academic. This is sort of my bread and butter thing, is lots and lots of tables. But I'll sort of go through all of them as they go up if you're squinting from the back. So there are a lot of different reasons why academics think that countries want to get nuclear weapons. So some people argue that it has to do essentially with international security, which seems pretty straightforward. We think that countries that get in more disputes with other ones, those that lack allies, those that face a conventional threat from a neighboring country, those that face a nuclear threat, countries that are major powers in the international system, so and those who see themselves as regional powers. There are also a number of things on this list which aren't necessarily causes of proliferation, but reasons why countries might not. And by the way, just to give away, so the green ones are the theories which sort of the North Korea case gives evidence for, and the red ones are ones which the North Korea case of acquiring nuclear weapons is evidence against. So countries that are economically open tend to try to get nuclear weapons less, mostly because they're worried about a threat of economic sanctions. Also, for the same reason, those that are economically liberalizing and those that have sanctions placed on them as well, connected to that economic openness. I have a social position here, so a lot of international relations focuses on the stuff, right? Guns, bombs, money, but some of the things focus on relations between countries. As some international relations theorists point out, that we do need to think about relationships because, how else can we explain why we're really concerned about North Korea's 30 to 60 nuclear weapons and we're not concerned about Britain's nuclear weapons? Right? You can't actually explain that with stuff, you have to explain it with relationships between countries. And so there's a number of arguments about how the Non-Proliferation Treaty in particular, if you belong to it, are you less likely to get nuclear weapons? If enough countries join it, does that make it more difficult for them to get nuclear weapons? Some countries are motivated by symbolic motivations or by prestige. So even though it is sort of, not really, a coincidence that the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, each of who has a veto over important world affairs, just happen to be the 5 countries that are allowed to have nuclear weapons under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so the prestige of having nuclear weapons is often an important motivation. There's some arguments, I'm not going to go through these much in depth, this is a little bit more academic, having to do with, if you have domestic unrest, you might be more likely to get nuclear weapons. If you're a democracy, some people say you're less likely. It turns out you're actually sort of more likely to get nuclear weapons, or there's no effect there. So democratizing countries, maybe that has something to do with it. If there's a global level of democracy, there's a theory called the democratic peace, which postulates that there's an empirical finding that countries that are both democracies tend not to fight each other in wars, although there's lots of different arguments over why exactly this is. Some people say that it's because they get along and they recognize each other's democracies. Some people say it's really just all about the money. That's a separate topic, but that those sorts of theories also spill over into international relations around nuclear weapons as well. Bureaucratic politics, so sometimes there's a little enclave of a group within a state that really wants nuclear weapons and sort of keeps it alive, even if the government itself isn't paying too much attention to it. And then there's some really interesting things about psychology of individual leaders that people write about, how individual leaders are particularly disposed to think of their enemies as those that, well, essentially you could kill with nuclear weapons. It's a horrific thing to think about, in that if particular leaders are more predisposed towards that, then they're more likely to say, okay, let's go ahead and build these bombs. Then finally, there's some talk about domestic capability. So does a country have to have a certain level of development, so GDP per capita, in order to construct nuclear weapons? And this is one of those cases where you say, well, if North Korea did it, then those theories are probably wrong. Even before that, Pakistan actually did it at a lower level of GDP per capita than North Korea even has today. So there's a lot of doubt about that one. General economic capacity, competence. general competence. I'll actually talk about this later. Some people have argued that, that the DPRK didn't seem to be all that competent at building all kinds of things and that this disproves it. I actually will argue the opposite, that they actually have demonstrated a lot of competence in bringing in foreign technology and then reproducing it domestically. And then there's some other things like effort. If you try really hard, you're more likely to get nuclear weapons than if you don't try really hard. And there are cases like Libya that didn't really try very hard and weren't very competent and didn't have a lot of, there's a lot of different factors. You can't really pull them apart. There are some definite cases. Italy sort of pretended for a while that it wanted a nuclear weapons for a couple of years. There's an article on it called Me Too, Please. But essentially it was just a bargaining chip and an attempt to convince the US to allow them to sort of have their own finger on the button inside of NATO. And then finally, there's arguments about just the general diffusion of technology. As time passes, it becomes, generally speaking, easier to create or recreate technologies which have been around. And nuclear weapons are a pretty old technology, right? 1940s. And then finally, some people argue that assistance from other countries is key in doing that. So there's a huge number of different factors. There's very little agreement about which factors are important or not. I think that the ones which people sort of do agree on that, well, generally countries don't do it for no reason. And generally they have some sort of a security threat going on. In the case of North Korea, they have a lot of these factors all at the same time. They have very few allies. They have an enormous conventional threat on their border. They feel threatened by US nuclear weapons, so there's a nuclear threat as well. There's a lot of different factors. If I was North Korea, I would want nuclear weapons. It's kind of a rough neighborhood. So, a lot of different reasons. So, one might ask then, why nuclear weapons in particular? They seem expensive. They take a really long time to manufacture. You might get invaded if you attempt to make nuclear weapons, or even seem maybe to be making nuclear weapons. And there are particular reasons why countries choose this as opposed to, say, building more tanks or planes. We can talk about chemical and biological weapons if people are interested later on as well. So why are these so attractive? Well, the first, of course, is the greater psychological effect. There's Thomas Schelling, who was an early sort of theorist of nuclear deterrence, said, well, there's nothing that you can do with nuclear weapons that you can't do with guns. It just takes a lot more time, and there's an enormous psychological effect to threatening to kill or killing that many people all at the same time. It allows countries to hurt or threaten to hurt each other without breaking through defenses. So when you need to, so in sort of warfare and land warfare, at least prior to the arrival of bombers, in order to attack the civilian population, you actually had to invade the country. You had to take it over, you had to break through their military. Nuclear weapons, like bombing, but on a much larger scale, allow countries to hurt. Now, this is important, not because anyone really wants to do this, but because that is the nature of deterrence. It's a threat to hurt someone if they do something that you don't want them to do. They're difficult to make obsolete. I'll talk a little bit later about missile defenses and why they really don't work for the most part. But it's really difficult to make nuclear weapons an obsolete technology. They're just as effective as they always have been. It's really attractive to dictators, better command and control. It's really attractive if you can push a button. There's not usually a literal button, but and then launch a missile and have it land in another country. You don't have to worry about too many people carrying out your orders in order to actually have the deterrent work. But you can't actually use it to invade other countries very effectively. Okay. It's hard to take territory. You can blow up territory with nuclear weapons, but you can't actually occupy territory with it. So then this leads to the question okay, they're really attractive, there's lots of reasons why countries would want nuclear weapons. Why are they so rare? Why do so few countries have nuclear weapons? Well, one reason is that there's been a massive international effort spearheaded primarily by the United States, but with cooperation from most of the world around the international non-proliferation regime. So the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Nuclear Suppliers Group, the Missile Technology Control Regime, all of these attempt to stop or slow the spread of technologies from countries to other countries, or limit which particular technologies can go from one country to another. So the Non-Proliferation Treaty does allow for civilian assistance, nuclear power reactors, and I can talk a little bit about how that may or may not end up aiding proliferation in some countries and maybe not in others later. But there's been a huge amount of effort going on, and that's sometimes underestimated. So Kennedy at one point made a speech saying, you know, we're going to have 25, 30 countries are going to have nuclear weapons, which was, and everyone has sort of looked back and said, oh, no, he was wrong. It's not that he was wrong. It's that he then spearheaded a massive effort to keep other countries from getting nuclear weapons. The Non-Proliferation Treaty is one of the most popular treaties. You know, there are about 4 countries that actually haven't signed it at this point. Whenever there's a new country, like one of the first things to do to prove that yes, we're a real country is that they sign this. It's sort of an automatic thing to demonstrate that yes, we are going to be a good citizen of the world. Another reason that they're massively expensive. They are not cheap at all. Our attempted modernization will cost at least $1 trillion and probably 2. And that's just to refurbish the ones we have now. Most countries spend a lot of money on nuclear weapons. Now, there's an exception in that South Africa made what was referred to as an affordable bomb that only cost $300 million. That's because they only built 8 of them. They're very simple. They didn't actually have a reason or to make them or a way of delivering them. I think they said that they could kick one out of the back of an airplane if they absolutely needed to. So there are exceptions to this, but most countries seem to want to go for like the deluxe model, right? They want a huge arsenal. They want lots of missiles. They don't really go for sort of the minimal, we just need a few of these, that's it. As a side note, some of the intelligence about Iran is that Iran's original plans prior to 2003 did involve just a very minimal arsenal, you know, about 5 to 10 weapons. So another reason is that these aren't, a lot of the technologies which you need to create or recreate or import or whatnot are not dual use. They're not really terribly useful for other things. Nuclear weapons are actually only really useful for one thing, which is deterring other nuclear weapons for the most part. So it's not like, oh, you know, we invent this technology, we do something new in a plane, and then we can apply it to civilian industries. It's just sort of, it's money which is you're essentially just burning. And then finally, it's technically complex. Not because the design is, per se, you know, you get a couple of decent physicists, they can probably sketch out a plan for a weapon, but actually putting one together is a huge pain in the ass. It's actually really difficult to shape it. It's working with very exotic metals and materials that really don't get along very well with each other. The number of failed tests, even in the US, is actually quite staggering. These things are not easy to manufacture. All right, so attractive, but fortunately, there are reasons why we don't have too many. Now, I'm betting that most of you won't be able to see this. I want to just make a couple points about this. This is a list of all countries that have considered trying to make nuclear weapons. Now, some of these did not try very hard at all. So those that are in the left-hand column here, those are countries that have explored it, which is to say that they sort of had a commission, they had some people talk about it, they may have done a few small experiments, but they didn't try all that hard. In the middle, this pursuit column, those are countries that actually did something about it. They built some facilities, they attempted to make some of the fissile materials on very small levels, which are required for nuclear weapons. And then, of course, acquire, this list here on the right, are countries that have actually managed to get nuclear weapons. So there's good news here in that even though many more countries than you would have thought have tried, it means that the success rate is actually pretty low. The second point is that it takes most of these countries actually quite a long time to actually acquire it, which leads to sort of a very interesting puzzle about nuclear weapons, which is why does it take countries so long, given that it's a 1945 era technology, and why are there so few countries that have succeeded? So this is a graph by a colleague of mine, Jacques Heymans, who went through the ones in black here are the ones that have succeeded, and the ones in white on the bottom are ones that have failed, or that's how long they were trying before they gave up, with Iran sort of being in this intermediate, they haven't succeeded or failed. The program's frozen at this particular point. The interesting thing about this is that as you go along in time, it gets longer. Right? It doesn't take countries less time, which is normally what you would expect with most technologies. Take them longer. Now, there are many reasons for this, but some of the most important ones do have to do with the non-proliferation regime, making it difficult for countries to acquire them in the first place. And one of the primary things which people tend to worry about with respect to countries getting nuclear weapons is other countries helping them, and helping them do it more quickly than they would have otherwise. So, who has helped? So this is a chart of all of the various countries that have helped each other in some way or another in a way which seems pretty apparent that they were helping them to get nuclear weapons. This wasn't, say, building a couple of power plants, right? Even though that has helped. So India used a civilian heavy water reactor in order to make the plutonium for their first nuclear weapon. That's not actually on this chart. But this is stuff which is unmistakably. So special use facilities, or in certain cases, they gave them nuclear weapons design. And I like this chart in part because it looks like nuclear fission. So if you've ever seen a chart of nuclear fission, one splits and sends some neutrons out, and those split and send neutrons out, and so on and so forth. And this is the big concern of Kennedy and people today, is that, this is just a chain reaction that's going to keep going and keep going and keep going as countries help other countries, which help other countries, and so forth. So the good news is that since this, the original research was done on this, there's exactly one more country which should be on this list, which is Syria. North Korea was helping to build a reactor in the desert in Syria. The Israelis bombed it just before it was finished. So the bad news is that there's lots of help. The good news is that not that many of these countries have actually succeeded, and fewer countries are helping each other these days. So in red are all of the countries that have actually succeeded. You'll see that there are some countries which have gotten help and succeeded, like China, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel. But there are many countries that didn't get this sort of, not dual use, very specifically for nuclear weapons help, and have succeeded. So United Kingdom, United States, India, South Africa, and France all did it more or less on their own. I say that with an asterisk, in part because the Manhattan Project was really an international nuclear weapons development. So in part because the vast number of scientists from other countries, and many, many scientists from Germany who left and came to the US, actually helped develop nuclear weapons in the first place there. So the saying the United States did not get help is sort of ignoring that it was this huge multidisciplinary international collaboration that happened to take place in the US. So there's good news and bad news here. I think that the good news does outweigh the bad news in that despite this help, many countries haven't gotten nuclear weapons. Some of them have gotten it without it. And when you look at the individual stories of who helped who and when, that the story starts to come apart. All right. This is another way of looking at the same graph. I have it done in this way as well, so you can look at a contrast between, this is what the nuclear assistance network looks like. This is the ballistic missile network, right? A lot more dense, a lot of countries reciprocating help back and forth. Not every single line on here, mind you, is help in the way you would think of it. I think at least one of these was when a country launched a ballistic missile at another one and didn't explode, and so they took it apart and figured out how it worked. That's not really help, per se. But this has to do with the difficult, complex nature of nuclear weapons, is that countries actually, it's difficult for them to help each other. And a lot of times the help doesn't help all that much. We can compare this with the major conventional weapons network, which is just dense. Everyone is trading arms with everyone. There's not a whole lot of technical difficulties or problems going on here. All right, this is with David Kinsella, who's here at Portland State. So, and the U.S. is one of the world's largest arms exporter, by the way. Okay, so why hasn't helped work better? So this gets into my research, which has to do with what exactly does it take to make nuclear weapons anyway? And the important takeaway here is two things. One is that it requires tacit knowledge. Now, there's a picture of Einstein here, not because Einstein is not smart. He wasn't smart. He's smart, he had a lot of knowledge, but because he's riding a bicycle. That's because tacit knowledge is something that you can only gain through actually trying it yourself. So if you've had kids and you attempted to help them ride a bicycle, you know that you can't actually just sort of explain it to them and have them hop on and go away. They're going to crash 10 or 15 times before they finally figure out exactly how to, get the balance part down and the pedaling part down. Your kids now, actually, they have these special balance bikes. They can separate out the pedaling from the balancing part. I don't know why they just couldn't do it the hard way like we had to, but anyway. So there's a lot of tacit knowledge required in order to do this. And so it requires a lot of trial and error. And those errors have to be something which are permitted, which are allowed, and many countries are not very good at allowing their scientists to make errors very often. I'm going to skip past some of this. This is advanced network theory, which if you have questions about network analysis, I'm happy to talk about that as well. This is my other sideline. It is difficult to create. It's difficult to transfer in-house. So this is a nuclear weapons shot tower. There's a problem with it in that it's still here. You can see that someone tried to detonate a nuclear weapon at the top of this, but all you got was a few mangled bars at the top. And this is the first test that the second nuclear weapons lab in the US tried, Livermore. So in fact, their first and second test both looked like this. So scientists at the first nuclear weapons lab were delighted by this, and the Livermore tried to pull down the tower before, but Los Alamos took photos of it before they could do that. And they made jokes about, hey, can we borrow your tower after the next test which you make? And this is under ideal conditions, right? Country has a lot of money, very bright people who've worked on things before, and sometimes they still screw up. What happens? Well, if you have what neo-patrimonial governing structures, which is a very fancy term for authoritarian regimes that rely on their brothers or uncles or someone really reliable to run things as opposed to someone who's competent. So Mao actually undermined his own nuclear weapons program multiple times, and it was only when someone managed to insulate and get him to stop mucking with it that it succeeded. So he said, let 1,000 flowers bloom, and said, all of the workers who are working on this nuclear weapons project, you should just experiment around. On whatever it is that you're doing, do whatever you like with it. While trial and error is good, absolutely everyone in a production complex doing trial and error all at the same time doesn't really produce very good results. So they were set back a year as a result of this. In the Soviet Union, however, they were actually fairly well protected, which is why they were able to create nuclear weapons and thermonuclear weapons. I'll get into the difference later. Fairly well. So, second reason is competence. You've probably seen this at some point before, and maybe not this photo, but someone who has a very fancy, fast car who has then wrapped it around a telephone pole. So just because you have the tools doesn't mean you know actually how to use them. And there are many countries that have the tools, import the assistance, but really don't know what to do with them. So this is because you actually need a big science and technology infrastructure in order to make nuclear weapons. And in the US, you could just rely on that. Research universities, labs, manufacturing, which you could make precision parts very easily. This is at the University of Chicago. It's called Nuclear Energy. It's a Henry Moore sculpture, which is a combination of a mushroom cloud and a death's head. And it's at the site of the first man-made sustained nuclear chain reaction. which they did in a squash court underneath the bleachers at the University of Chicago. Obviously, the stadium is not there anymore, and not just because it was radioactive. But the thing is that the Manhattan Project could rely on all these universities already existing, all these scientists working on all of these different projects. Second argument is that you have particularly people who are really good at managing large-scale socio-technical enterprises, which is it's a fancy way of saying really big projects which are complicated, especially ones that involve trying to get a bunch of scientists to work together. Now, I don't know if any of you are scientists or have worked with scientists. They're not necessarily known as the most collaborative, talkative, social people. Many of them, I'm on a faculty, I go to an all-faculty meeting, and it's 130 people in a room, all of whom think they're the smartest person in the room. We rarely get anything done as a result of it. So having someone who can successfully manage all of the egos in the room is actually really important. Some countries have someone who's really good at this, and some don't. We know North Korea does, in part because in all the photos which North Korea's, they'll periodically put photos of, what's going on in their nuclear weapons complex. Always the same guy, right? Hasn't been shot. So we can tell that there's sort of some consistency in management over time. And that both of these are undermined by the sort of, authoritarian states. This is, of course, Gaddafi. It has one of his female ninja bodyguards in the background, so I like this photo so much. But he essentially completely undermined his own nuclear weapons program. Failing to provide any structure, any guidance, he sort of threw a lot of money out there with no monitoring even. People didn't bother showing up for work because no one was checking. And, commute's kind of long, why bother? So by not managing it correctly, it's actually very crucial. Or sometimes there are organizational conditions that fail to reward competence, keep incompetent people on the job for long periods of time. That can also undermine it. All right. So, DPRK. This is based on a Twitter thread in which someone said, there's this great photo of Kim Jong-un, watching a missile, and someone's like, that looks like a Pink Floyd album cover, and someone made a Pink Floyd album cover, The Delicate Sound of Rockets. All right, so how do they succeed when other countries with more money or better assistance, how do they manage to do it? Well, the first thing is that they took explicit knowledge, which is blueprints, parts, machines, they imported them, and then instead of saying, let's copy this, they said, how does this work? Let's take it apart. Let's figure out why they made the design decisions that they made. North Korea is very good at this. A colleague of mine recently remarked that they had started importing 3D printers, and then a couple of years later, there are photos, and their own homegrown 3D printers are sitting there on the table. They're not content with just copying something else, which is a good way of not understanding something. But they're really good at taking things back to the basics and recreating that sort of knowledge, the tacit knowledge, locally. They mostly relied on their own homegrown indigenous efforts. So Juche is the doctrine of North Korea that essentially it's autarky, independence, doing things on their own. And this actually helped. So countries like Iran that attempted to import a lot of things. One of the great things about countries that try to import parts, technology, etc., in order to make nuclear weapons is that it's pretty obvious when they're trying to do that, which makes for great time to sabotage stuff. So all kinds of shipments of things that went into Iran, we knew what parts they were. There was a computer virus which was written because we knew exactly what the controllers were that were controlling some of their machines, and managed to essentially make the centrifuges which they were using to make fissile material for nuclear weapons, made them spin too fast and crash. So the other part of it is that even if you're not engaging in sabotage, everyone thinks you're going to try to sabotage, so they have to check everything as it comes in. So it actually slows down the whole process of making them in the first place. But North Korea didn't use that route. They imported things and then made their own. They made better technology choices. They went the plutonium route. So every country that successfully exploded a nuclear weapon, the first one was a plutonium instead of highly enriched uranium. So they chose the right technology route. This is, again, one of the reasons why Iran, fortunately, was stopped far short of it, is that they didn't go the easier way. It doesn't say an easy way, but it's easier to have a certain type of reactor, put some uranium in it, some fuel rods, run it for a year or two, extract them out, and then separate out the plutonium, which has been created within those fuel rods. The enriched uranium involves a very complicated process of trying to separate out. So natural uranium only has less than 1% of the stuff, uranium-235, which is what you actually need. You need like 90% of uranium, which is 90% that, in order to make a nuclear weapon. Well, so you essentially have to, pick out all of the atoms you don't like from that. You have to exploit this very, very small difference in the weight of those individual atoms. And so it's a very complicated process, and North Korea chose right. I mean, I'm not saying this is a good thing, but it is one of the reasons why they succeeded, and Iran has not so far. Hopefully we'll continue not succeeding. The last part is parallel, well, two more things. One is parallel development. So I'll talk about thermonuclear and thermonuclear weapons shortly. Most countries that started out saying, okay, we're going to make a nuclear weapon first, and then we'll make a thermonuclear weapon, which you essentially need a small regular nuclear weapon in order to make a thermonuclear weapon. And instead of saying, okay, we're going to do one and then we're going to do the other, they did these on parallel tracks. So not very long after their first test of a nuclear weapon, they actually exploded one, which is almost certainly a thermonuclear weapon, a relatively short period of time after that. And then finally, just determination and patience. They've been working on this for 30 years. And the program was frozen from about 1994 to about 2002, so that there is 8 years in there which they weren't actually working very actively on it. But I mean, it is true that this is a 1945 technology, so if you have determination, patience, the right people, the right technologies, and you just work at it long enough, it can be done. All right. How powerful are their weapons? So I won't go deeply into these diagrams. This is a standard sort of nuclear weapon. It's an implosion weapon. What it does is that the core inside of here, which is plutonium, or it could also be highly enriched uranium, you have explosives around it which compress it and start the reaction and hold it in long enough for enough fissions to occur in order to have a large explosion, essentially. Now, a thermonuclear weapon has one of these inside of it. This is called a primary, and then it has a secondary here, which creates a fusion reaction like that which occurs in the sun. So instead of fissioning heavy atoms, uranium or plutonium, it fuses together very light atoms, so which are different isotopes. So deuterium, tritium, lithium is actually used in this. There's a joke about how nuclear weapons designers can be depressed, but nuclear weapons are not, because they always have their lithium, which is true. And this creates a much, much larger explosion. How much larger? So here we are in Portland. This is a website called NukeMap, which a colleague of mine made. So you can go and explode nuclear weapons anywhere you like in the world. And he says overwhelmingly, the first time someone logs in, they nuke right where they're sitting. Doesn't seem like a great idea, but okay. So their 2013 test, which was, so this is the first really successful nuclear weapon test. They had about 10 kilotons were here. So at this point, if this is so downtown Portland, at this point, you're like, oh, maybe it's a really good idea to live on the east side. Woodstock's looking good. And you can go and do this yourself. It'll give you casualty estimates. You can do all kinds of different things like this. You can do fallout clouds. So just search for NukeMap and you can find this. So unfortunately, this is the 2017 test, which was a thermonuclear weapon, much larger effects, much larger radius. This outside one is sort of broken windows. This is that at least half the people within the orange one will be dead. And you can see that in the casualty counts here. So at this point, Powellhurst looks good, Park Rose, maybe Vancouver. Vancouver looks pretty good at this point. So, of course, Portland isn't exactly a prime target. I don't think Kim Jong-un hates hipsters. It sort of seems like one himself, so, I don't actually worry about this scenario. I mean, I worry about other things, but this is not a thing that I worry about too much. About here, about where the 30B is. So, just outside, that wasn't planned. I used to live off Hawthorne, but that's not so good. All right. So then there's been this very consistent, we will not let Kim Jong-un develop thermonuclear weapons and ICBMs to put them on. The bad news, that has already happened. So I've given this part of this talk before. I had to keep revising it as I was giving it. So in October 2017, this is North Korea. These are curved because when you launch missiles, it follows the Great Circle route. So when you fly to Europe or Asia, sometimes you'll go over the pole. That's also the trajectory of the ballistic missiles. So in October 2017, when the US government was saying, we will not let Kim Jong-un develop an ICBM, so the biggest one, which they had tested, had a range about here, which was not great because it meant that they still couldn't hit DC. They could hit us, but not DC. So if they're going to be able to hit us, being able to hit DC is also a good idea. And sure enough, in November of 2017, they tested another one, which in fact can hit DC as well. So how do we know that these are the ranges? Well, oop, went too far. There we go. We know this is, I'll just briefly, technical details, that they've been launching these on a lofted trajectory, so they shoot them almost straight up. And so what we do is we essentially just time how long it takes to go up and come down, and then adjust that for if you actually shot it on a trajectory which went around the world. So that's how we can estimate these types of things. This article also had I'll call it an optimistic description of missile defense. I'll explain why that really doesn't work too well shortly. So, all right, North Korea has missiles, has thermonuclear weapons. So what have we done? I'll just briefly do this. This is an exercise for one of my classes. I teach them how to make good threats. I then threaten them if they are ever to make threats to anyone else in the class that I will come after them. I try to be specific, so I try to be clear. I try to communicate to, you have to communicate to someone exactly what kind of, what exactly it is you're going to do. You want to know the date, when the threat will be carried out, the damage, what will happen, and the demand, how to avoid it. If you don't know these things, you're not going to be able to, the target won't know exactly what it is they're supposed to be thinking about. It has to be credible. You have to want to carry out the threat. So this is one of the problems with massive retaliation during the Cold War, is that there was no reason why, if we had a massive missile strike coming in, why we would really want to kill the other half of the world's population at that point, right? Deterrence has already failed. You have to be capable. You have to have the ability to carry out the threat. So you have to have, the missiles and the weapons and so forth, and this is what North Korea has now demonstrated. Unless it has to be calculable, which is to say that whoever it is you're trying to threaten has to be able to sort of rationally weigh, like, well, here's your demand, here's, I don't really want to do that, but here's what you're threatening, here's how likely it is I think that you're going to do that, and decide whether, yeah, I do want to do this or I don't want to do this. All right, so this is who threatened better. So, first threat, North Korea just stated that it is in the final stages of developing a nuclear weapon capable of reaching parts of the US. It won't happen. This is a terrible threat in that it is merely an assertion that something will not happen. So that sort of fails on all counts. The DPRK then responded with saying that if the supreme dignity of the DPRK is threatened, it must preemptively annihilate those countries and entities that are involved in it by mobilizing all kinds of strike. If they show even the slightest sign of attempting to remove supreme leadership, strike a merciless blow at the heart of the US with our powerful nuclear hammer honed and hardened over time. Now, there's a bit of purple prose in here, but it's a good threat. It says, don't try to remove our leadership. If you do, we will conduct a nuclear strike. Okay. Here's the counter threat. If they make threats, they will be met with fire and fury. It has been very threatening beyond a normal state. They will be met with fire, fury, and frankly, power, the likes of which this world has never seen before. This is an odd threat in that it's a threat that says, I want you to stop making threats. And it's not really a very credible threat in that someone just making threats doesn't actually hurt you. And so saying, don't make any more threats or we'll attack you effectively with nuclear weapons just doesn't really balance out the whole credible, capable thing. Then,
Alex,
yeah.
I don't mean to threaten you, but the time is kind of catching up with us.
Okay.
The damage will be done, and I know that there are a lot of questions in here, so I want to make sure that we get a little bit of time to do that. So.
No, okay. What's the damage?
The likes of which the world has never seen.
Fire and fury. Touche. Sorry, I wasn't watching the time very carefully. I'll skip past the rest of these. These are all pretty bad. I'll post them. I'll post them up. All right. I'll put them on my website, and you can decide for yourselves who threatened better. All right. I want to just say a couple specific things about the nuclear posture review. So, ballistic missile defenses is what I want to focus on. So, if anyone remembers this, the Hawaii drill, that should not give you a lot of confidence in our ability to detect incoming warheads. It turns out that the effectiveness of our warheads, they say it's 97% effective. That's if we launch 4 interceptors against every North Korean warhead. We have 40 interceptors. Anyone who knows math will know that North Korea, therefore, is about to build 11 nuclear missiles so that it can overwhelm the system. There's another problem in that the path of North Korea's missiles will actually pass over Russia and China. So if they fire missiles and then we fire interceptors, interceptors also look a lot like incoming ballistic missiles with nuclear weapons. So we have we have a chance of actually setting off a wider conflict. This is not so important. This is demonstrating that, in fact, our nuclear posture review is like, oh my gosh, we don't have any ways of delivering them. And these are the things that someone left out when they created the nuclear posture review. This is don't know much about geography, and that first they accidentally published it with North Korea has overrun South Korea. They fixed that. They forgot to, and China has invaded Taiwan, and Russia has invaded the Kuril Islands. So it took them multiple drafts to actually get maps right in the nuclear posture review, which should also not give you a great deal of confidence in our ability to do that. All right, last slide. 2 things. Why is North Korea doing this in public? Right? Why are there all these photos of Kim Jong-un looking at things? This is a great way of demonstrating capability. Right? They're showing technically important photos, which then experts can go and analyze and say, oh, yeah, I believe it. That is exactly the thing that they say it is. So what should we do about this? Well, this is a bad idea because they now have nuclear weapons. This is an idea where you just sort of gradually ramp up sanctions. Unfortunately, we have already ramped up sanctions as much as anyone else in the world is going to support. This is also a terrible idea, seeing as they have just threatened to retaliate using nuclear weapons if we try it. So the main takeaway here is, what should we do? Well, North Korea's nuclear weapons, we're going to have to accept it. Now we need to move into arms control. stop them from helping anyone else, stop them from building more nuclear weapons, get them to agree not to build more missiles. And I was actually kind of hopeful for the summit, but as you probably all know, that ended early, but not acrimoniously. All right, I'll stop there so that people can ask questions. I'll stick around a little bit afterwards if people have additional questions as well. So, thank you.
And since we are short on time, make sure that you're asking an actual question and not pontificating, because I will rain fire and fury down upon you. Someone's got to have a question.
Is it on? You said when you were showing the thermonuclear bomb, that's not what you're really concerned about. Your biggest worry. What is your biggest worry?
Well, what I meant by that is I'm not really worried about the U.S. hitting Portland specifically. My biggest worry is not intentional nuclear war, it's accidental, where there are miscommunications back and forth, missignals between the U.S. and North Korea, which would lead, so one of the scenarios, North Korea thinks we're trying to decapitate them, and they try to sort of stop that by doing a demonstration strike against something. So a colleague of mine, Jeffrey Lewis, has written a book called, I'm going to get this, might be slightly wrong. So Jeffrey Lewis is his name. It's the 2020 Commission Report on the it's the Commission Report on the 2020 North Korean nuclear attacks. He calls it a speculative novel, and essentially goes through a plausible scenario in which these accidents back and forth happen, each one of them based on a thing which has happened in the past. So during the Cuban Missile Crisis or various different other crises, and builds this very plausible and quite terrifying scenario in which there's an accidental exchange. And there are things we can do to prevent that, like establishing hotlines and between the US and North Korea, but that requires acceptance first that they have nuclear weapons. They're not going to go away anytime soon. It's a great read. You won't sleep very well afterwards, though, so don't start it in the evening.
I have a question about, I've never quite understood why France helped so many people or tried to help them, whereas the United Kingdom and the US did not.
That's a great question. So France, most of the explanation was that France is sort of a middle power, and that doesn't really explain why not the UK, but I have some reasons why I think there's a difference between them. During the Cold War, didn't have the punch or the reach or diplomatic power or influence that the US and the Soviet Union did. And so one really easy way of making friends is to help other countries with their nuclear weapons programs, to the extent that France, all the ones that they helped, they believed would not threaten France and would further its own interests elsewhere. So it's sort of the inverse of the US's policy, which is we will cover all of you with our nuclear deterrent so you don't have to have the weapons, where France had interests in other areas or wanted alliances or friendships or whatever, however you want to think about it. Their strategy was, well, we don't think that us offering to cover you with our weapons is credible, right? There's this whole question of, is in fact the U.S. going to trade, D.C. for Paris? And the answer is, well, probably not, which is why the French have their own nuclear weapons. And so they helped a number of countries sort of to get at least closer to those weapons as a result. So.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for your presentation. I found it to be excellent and very informative, and you are obviously very knowledgeable. Very quickly, can you just briefly comment on the situation between India and Pakistan?
Sure. So India and Pakistan are particularly concerning because the U.S. and the Soviet Union during the Cold War had about a half an hour in between them in terms of ballistic missiles. And so at least in theory, there was a little bit more time in order to try to determine, are they in fact attacking us? And if no, then we don't actually need to respond. The big concern about India and Pakistan is that they are so close to each other that they will effectively have no warning. On top of that, there's a problem that Pakistan, because of their much smaller conventional military, has sort of forward deployed its nuclear weapons. which means that they would be in a situation, if India happened to invade Pakistan, they would be in a situation of use it or lose it, which is a situation which could lead to nuclear first use. The additional problem is that India has had this doctrine, although I don't think they've actually implemented it, which is good, called cold start. And the whole idea was that, well, we're going to just grab, if in a war, we would grab Pakistan's territory so quickly that they wouldn't be able to use nuclear weapons against us, in retaliation for something, for example. And Pakistan's doctrine is that they will not use nuclear weapons first unless it's on their own territory against India. So these are two competing threats and doctrines which are very unstable in that they could, if deterrence fails in this case, or India just thinks it can grab something, then there's a much higher probability of first use by Pakistan, which is one of the reasons was concerned. I'm slightly less concerned now about the back and forth that India and Pakistan have been doing, with India going over and bombing something, and then Pakistan coming back over for sort of a retaliatory thing, and then the Indian pilot being shot down. So I'm very encouraged by the fact that the Pakistani military recognized that, and the government recognized that this is an opportunity to de-escalate. And so there's, pictures of him, drinking chai and thinking, oh, this is so good. And, they returned him now as a way of trying to, decrease this back and forth. Part of the problem here is that, India struck, and that sort of should have been good enough for the Indian domestic public, but Pakistan and said, oh, you only hit some trees. Which means that lowers Pakistan's need to retaliate in such a way, but it also means that in India that raises the chance that they'll have to take additional actions. So this sort of coupling is particularly worrisome. I don't think that anyone there wants to use nuclear weapons, is irrational, irresponsible, or any of these other things, just that the actual geography and the military situation there is such that they have more incentives, and they've adopted doctrines which make nuclear use more likely.
In 30 seconds or less. Yeah, thanks for your insights. What's your insight on the treaty with Iran that we're walking away from? What's the good points, the bad points, and can it be used as a model, a treaty with North Korea in 29 seconds or less? It was a terrific deal. It was much better than I thought that we were going to be able to get with Iran. And the main point of it is that Iran we basically get to sit on them for about 10 to 15 years and have the most intrusive inspections any country has ever had. And even someone who suspects Iran, who thinks that their intentions are malign, they're going to go back to making nuclear weapons, it's good even for that because we would be much more likely to catch them doing anything during that period of time. Now, it does kick the ball down the road a little bit, in 10 to 15 years, maybe they will want to do that again. But in that case, we could go through the same thing again, demanding inspectors, putting on sanctions, so on and so forth. So it was a pretty good deal, and Iran is complying with it, and is still complying with it. In terms of a model, so because North Korea already has nuclear weapons, it's less of a good model in terms of that. And it's also not a great model because we walked away from the Iran one, so why would North Korea believe that we wouldn't walk away from a deal with them? But you should think of it more with the India model, in that essentially in exchange for India making certain promises about non-proliferation, that they're sort of brought back into the regular nuclear order, and the U.S. sort of allowed for civilian nuclear trade to occur with India. So that's sort of a deal I could see, putting a cap on North Korea's capabilities, having people to verify that. In order to sort of bring North Korea at least a little bit back out of the cold. So.
Okay, we are at time. I want to thank you all again. To quote the great nuclear policy expert Fred Astaire, there may be trouble ahead, but while there's moonlight, music, and romance, let's just face the music and dance. And we'll see you next week.